Last week, Pastor Smith started our study in the book of Daniel, and I would like to continue that, laying out the fact that the captivity that Nebuchadnezzar was planning and carrying out, executing, was the results of many years of God's intervention with the nation of Israel, begging them, pleading with them, encouraging them to repent, to change, to trust the Lord, to walk with the Lord, and they failed to do so. It seems that Israel, from what we know from these couple passages here in 2 Chronicles and also Jeremiah, that for 70 Sabbaths, and those Sabbaths were rather unique, and one of them was every seventh year, Israel was told that they could, for 6 years, they could plant whatever they wanted to plant in the land, but the seventh year, they were, generally the sixth year, they would have enough food. They would not have to plant, and we could let the land rest for the seventh year. Then the next year they could start planting again. So you have that cycle of time, but also then every 50th year, then you had the year of Jubilee. So you had the 49 years, and that would have been a seventh year Sabbath. But then the 50th year would have been the next year. They were supposed to let the land rest at that time also. And it appears from 2 Chronicles that God was going to make the land rest, and he was going to make it rest for 70 years. So they had continued to plant during those years when they were supposed to let the land rest. They had missed 70 Sabbaths during that time. And in missing that time, of course, that it demonstrated that they were selfish. They felt they knew better than God, and so God had told them, "This is if you don't do this, you're going to pay the consequence. You're going to pay the price. Everything is going to fall apart. Things are going to be difficult for you, and I will take you off the land." And that, of course, does happen now when Daniel is when the captivity comes there in 606 BC. Because of Jeremiah, it says this whole land, verse 25, or chapter 25, verse 11, it says, "This whole land will be desolate and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then it will be, when 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity and the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation." It's as Daniel and some of these, Ezekiel, are looking at some of these prophecies, Jeremiah's prophecy, they hear about and they see that the captivity was to be 70 years, and so this gives them hope then as time runs down, and ultimately when Cyrus comes in, there is a permission now to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And ultimately, then under Nehemiah, they would go back and rebuild the city. But we pick up here in Daniel with some information, and I think it's good to just kind of glean as much as we can out of this first chapter here, because I think that it's important for us to understand the circumstances and some of the things that who Daniel was, what he was experiencing, and how God was working in all this. Because I think as sometimes we forget, we think today that, this is brand new. Nothing like this has ever happened before. We're facing experiences and circumstances right now that nobody's ever had gone through this before. Well, I think we know from a book of Ecclesiastes and other places that really there's nothing new under the sun. That others have been there, others have gone through similar circumstances, and a lot of times when you read them, sometimes you miss some of that application aspect of it. So I'm hoping today to kind of focus in on Daniel's recommendation to eat a certain food, and I think you'll see that there's a lot of application for today, because I think we are facing some really big challenges as far as Christians are concerned. And there's a thought and seemingly the implication that everybody and everything is against Christians. And I think we have to stop and back up a little bit and say, yeah, yes and no, but I think there's more to it than that, and we want to look at some of those things this morning. And so as we look at this, when to make a decision is ultimately what we're going to be looking at. But first of all, who was Daniel? Well, if you look at verses 3 and 4 of Daniel chapter 1, he says, "And the king spoke unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, youths in whom was no blemish, well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and gifted in knowledge and understanding science, and had as an ability in them to stand in the king's palace." So this individual was probably leading the siege of Jerusalem, was to look among the royalty, and probably we know from from 2 Kings chapter 20 that Isaiah speaks to Hezekiah 100 years before, and he tells Hezekiah, he said that the king of Babylon is going to come, and he's going to take some of your children, some of your seed, some of your offspring, and they're going to come, and they're actually going to serve in the palace of the king of Babylon. Interesting, when he gives Hezekiah this information, Babylon was simply a province of Assyria, and Babylon was nowhere in a position to do anything, because Nebuchadnezzar's father was really the one that had rebelled against Assyria and kind of sets up the kingdom of Babylon, and so it rose to power and importance very quickly. But for Hezekiah, even though he had this envoy come over from Babylon that he had showed them everything in the palace and all the treasures of the temple and things, it was no big deal. And the interesting thing about it, I know Pastor Dennis shared there in verses 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 16 and 18, and talking about the fact that this is what was going to happen. But I thought it was very interesting in verse 19. Verse 19, and this is Cal Lowder's paraphrase, it simply says, Hezekiah saying to Isaiah, boy, am I glad. It's not going to happen in my day. It's not going to happen now. It may happen, it's going to happen down the road, but it's not going to happen to me. And I thought, he's one of the early me generation people, where he's hey, it's not going to happen to me, and that's okay. And sometimes we feel the same way. Things are bad, things are, there's difficulties, so there's issues, there's problems and things like that. But it's okay right now. So as long as it's okay right now, I'm not worried, I'm not concerned. Rather than thinking about the fact, if this continues to go down as it's going down, what will happen to our grandchildren? What will it be like when our grandchildren are growing and have to make decisions and things like that? But back to Daniel. Daniel and three of his friends are part of this group of people that are taken captive and are taken out of Jerusalem and Judah and taken to Babylon. And I'm sure, we're not told anything about it, but I'm sure they did not rent Greyhound buses. They didn't, this was not treated well, because Jehoiakim had rebelled, and Nebuchadnezzar was coming over now to put down this rebellion. This was the first of three that would actually take place, because it would be Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah that would actually, all three of them would rebel in one way or another. Finally, Nebuchadnezzar said, "That's enough." And 587, he just flattens the whole area. But these guys, if you were to pick really top of the notch people, this was Daniel and his three friends, because it says that they were, number one, they royalty. They were of the king's family, some relation there to the king. Also, too, they had no blemish. There was no physical marks on them. Remember, there was for the priestly line anyway. You had to be a perfect specimen of a human being. As a matter of fact, one of the things was you couldn't even have a flat nose. It got down to the physical features had to be perfect if you were going to actually serve in the temple or serve the Lord. And that's the way it was with Daniel. Matter of fact, he talks about the fact that he was to be well favored, physically handsome. These were handsome young men. It's interesting that word is used numerous times of Rachel and others, that beautiful, they were beautiful people. And this was Daniel and his three friends. These were handsome young men, probably in their early teens, as far as we can tell, because Daniel goes through the entire 70 years. So if he was, say, 13, 14 years old, by the time Israel goes back out of captivity, Daniel would have been 83, mid-80s, and still serving the king of Cyrus, king of Persia and Media. So these guys were young guys, but very handsome, very good-looking, smart young men. If they would have been in school, they'd have been the top of their class. They were gifted in knowledge. They were understanding science. And they could speak well. They were good public speakers. They were able to communicate well, because that's one of the things when finally that Daniel and his three friends stand before the king. The king is blown away with their knowledge, their understanding, just everything that he had hoped for and wanted. These three young men personified those characteristics and things like that. So Daniel, he starts out with a tremendous, can I say, a tremendous pedigree. He's royalty. He's good looking and everything, and he now is one of the ones chosen, along with the other three friends. They're the ones that are chosen to serve to serve the king. The second thing that we find out is that we hear about Daniel's character. Now, there's not much said about it per se, but I think that it's assumed as you go through the book, you see it come out time and time again. And all I'm doing is picking out one verse of it, and that's in verse 8. But it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's food." So this was something that Daniel had determined ahead of time, probably in the training that he had back in Israel. Now, I think there was more to it with the king's food than just the fact that it was fattening and the wine and the things that. I think that probability is that this would be food that had been offered to idols, that had been offered to the Babylonian idols, because there's a lot of emphasis on the idols and the gods of Babylon. Matter of fact, Nebuchadnezzar, his name means "May Nebo protect the crown." So just his very name was in the sense that he was giving himself an honor and recognition to the gods. And so the probability is that the king's food, obviously, before it would be presented to the king, would have been blessed by the priests, by those that were serving in the court, and that Daniel purposed in his heart. He said, "No, that is not the way," because an Israelite was not to eat anything offered, obviously, to idols, and anything unclean. And so this would be something that Daniel, from childhood, would have been taught and trained, that you don't go there, you don't do those kind of things. And so Daniel purposed his heart, and this is why I mentioned about making decisions, because it's a struggle sometimes to, especially with young people, if they've not purposed in their heart ahead of time to live for the Lord and to serve the Lord and to walk with the Lord, many times it's very difficult to make that decision in the heat of the moment. It needs to be something that's done early. And so I say Daniel's character was such that he had determined early on that, and he didn't know what was going to happen when they were taken out of Jerusalem, when they were picked out, selected from whoever, and how, we're never told how many others that were brought with them. But when they were taken, they didn't know what was going to happen. But he apparently was determined that whatever it was, he was going to serve the Lord. And he does the rest of his life. And I think it's because of the fact he made that decision early. And he determined that he was going to serve the Lord. Well, number 3, what do we know about the king's design? We know from verse 4 that the design was that they would, notice at the end of verse 4 there, and whom they may teach to stand before the king's palace, to stand in the king's palace. And so the design was that he was looking for those wise men that would be the ones to give him direction, and that would remember when he had these dreams, he would call these wise men in and he would ask them. And of course, remember the problem came, and we'll see that when we get on a little bit further in the book. But he calls these wise men in, and these were the guys that were able to predict and give prognosis of things, to direct and give wisdom. So he wanted to train some of these young fellas, train them up in these areas so that they in turn would probably take over, because it was not uncommon. And one of the threats was that when Daniel gets to this vision, when Nebuchadnezzar gets to this vision, and he says, okay, tell me the vision and then tell me the interpretation. And these wise men said, well, we can't tell you the interpretation until you tell us the vision. And Nebuchadnezzar said, if you don't tell me the vision and the interpretation, I'm going to kill you. He probably was always looking for some new people to come in, because I'm sure that from time to time that he would take some of them out because they didn't do what he was supposed to do. So this is a type of thing. So Daniel and his 3 friends were going to be put into some very difficult training and time, but Nebuchadnezzar was looking for these top-notch young men who could really stand there and give him counsel and give him wisdom. Well, how was this going to happen? Well, first of all, it was going to be change of diet. Notice in verse 5, it says that the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's food and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end of time they might stand before the king. So first of all we're going to change the diet, and this becomes this is where the issue comes in for Daniel, because the diet. Well, if you're going to be a king, you're going to stand in the king's presence. Well, you need to have royal food. You need to eat the royal food, and so this was their obviously his way of doing something about that. Verse 6, he says, there are now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so you have these young men. And so he says, okay, I'm going to give you a diet. Also, too, he says, I'm going to give you a new name. And notice in verse 7, he said, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave Daniel, and then he gives these names. Now, we don't understand, we don't know the meaning of the names, so I'm going to try to give them to you here. Daniel means the judge is God. That was his name. And so the prince of the eunuchs renames him Belteshazzar, or Bel's prince. So now that rather than being a servant of God and living for God, he's now going to be a prince of Baal. He's going to be prince of this of the god of Babylon, chief god of Babylon. For Hananiah, and that's my pronunciation of it, it means the Lord is gracious. And his name is changed to Shadrach, illumined by the sun god. It was going to be his new name. Mishael, who and what is the Lord? To Meshach, who or what is Ishtar, the goddess of love. The Azariah, the Lord is my helper, is changed to Abednego, the servant of Nebo, the God of wisdom and education. So you have, okay, we're going to change your diet. We're going to change your name. And not only that, but back at chapter 4, it says there that right at the end of the verse, and whom they might teach the learnings and the tongues of the Chaldeans. We're going to change your diet. We're going to change your name. We're going to change your language. And we're going to change your education. And we're going to do that in 3 years' time. And so that 3-year period was going to be the time of basically indoctrination when they were going to try to make these total changes in these young men and force them, in a sense, to become Babylonians and to think like the Babylonians. Well, of course, the book of Daniel is the record of how Daniel is brought into that environment and yet remains true and remains able to stand and honor the Lord. The other thing which we're not really see much of, but just a couple little verses there, is that what do we know about God's oversight in the affairs of these men? Back in verse 1, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And 2 little words, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands. Who was orchestrating this whole scenario? It was God. God predicts and prophesies all the way back in Exodus, back in years and years before, that if you disobey me, you will be taken captive, you will be taken out of your land. He tells through Isaiah, tells Hezekiah 100 years before, he said, you're going to serve the king of Babylon. You're going to serve it for 60 or 70 years. These things are going to happen. This is the way it's going to be. These are the things that are going to take place. And God is orchestrating this. God brings it all about. Nebuchadnezzar's father rises up and against Assyria, establishes the kingdom of Babylon. Babylon ascends to tremendous power in a very short time. And God uses all these things. He puts all these things together to bring about the punishment of the nation of Israel for the 70 Sabbaths that they had disobeyed God. And so we see that in play there. Verse 9, it says also, now God had brought Daniel into favor and compassion with the prince of the eunuchs. And so here we see Daniel, that God in a very personal way not only works in the life of a nation, but he's working in the lives of individuals. We saw it back in Joseph's time, when Joseph finally says to his brothers, he said, you meant for evil, but God meant for good. And God was orchestrating a whole scenario there because he had a greater and bigger plan. And he uses individuals. And that's something I think we sometimes forget, the fact that even though we don't have the luxury of seeing having written down exactly what God is doing in our lives today, but I really believe God is orchestrating and working in the lives and the affairs of the world today. And he's using us, and he's using individuals. And many times we don't see that, we don't realize that. And I'm sure Daniel, at the time, now he writes some of this down, or at least the scribe writes it down for him about what is happening. But these are monumental things. These were tough times. And Ezekiel told the children of Israel, if you go to Babylon, you simply blend into the system and don't make a fuss and don't create a problem, and you'll do just fine. God will protect you, and you'll do just fine there. There'll be no problems whatsoever. Well, here's Daniel now. And all of a sudden, he comes into this situation. And the interesting thing is that the only thing, notice there the things that are changed. He's changed his diet. His name has changed. He's taught the education, and all of these things that are present there. But the only thing that he challenges, he never seems to challenge the name. And most of the time we have a hard time remembering the Hebrew names, but we can remember the Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We remember those names, but we don't remember the Hebrew names. They don't challenge that, but they challenge the food issue. Now, I want to say that as we look at this a little bit, and the importance of deciding ahead of time to do the right thing, what is it? There's a lot of times, I think, that we create problems for ourselves, even as Christians, because I think there's a lot of times we fight over things that we shouldn't even be fighting over. I think there's times that we become we become, I hate to say it, but we become very legalistic. We become so, we fight over a lot of things, and we want so many restrictions on things. And as I say, Daniel, there doesn't seem to be any issue about the names. There doesn't seem to be any issue about the education and those kind of things. There was only an issue there about the food. And even that was not really as big a deal as what we might think. Now, I presented as the fact that he had they asked them to eat something that had been offered to idols. But I think that Daniel recognized why he was being asked to eat that food. Because the prince of the eunuchs and Nebuchadnezzar, I'm sure, thought that this is the best food we have to offer. And if you guys are going to be in my court, and you guys are going to have the privilege of ministering to me as a king, I'm going to reward you and I'm going to honor you with the best food possible. Now, for Nebuchadnezzar, he had already settled in his mind, I think, that his God was much better than the God of Israel. And the reason being that he had conquered Israel. He had laid siege to them, and it didn't seem like their God had done anything about it. So obviously, my God, Baal and Nebo, are much better gods than the God of Israel. So I don't see what the big deal is about this. So I've given my food over to the gods. No big deal. It's the best food around. They probably had filet mignon. I don't know whether they would have had shrimp or not. I wish they would have. But they had very, very good food. Probably pork chops, maybe a little ham. And I'm sure that as Daniel hears about this, he said, we've got a problem here. Now, notice he didn't challenge him on the fact that he probably had offered it to his gods or not. He just simply said, I'm not going to defile myself with that particular food. Now, a lot of times we have to, I want to just go on here a little bit. Let me go through my notes, and then I'll come back and preach to you for the last 2 minutes. But why do you need to decide beforehand? I think for several reasons. One, doing the right thing is rarely popular and convenient. You think about this. Ezekiel has said, and now this probably happened, this probably precedes some of Ezekiel's writing, but very possibly he already heard this, that if you just conform, if you just go along with you go along to get along, everything's going to be okay, there's not going to be any problem, there's not going to be any issues. Well, why bring this up? Why? Because Daniel bringing this up, he could jeopardize the fact, because Nebuchadnezzar didn't take too kindly to people objecting or opposing them. And so it could have been very easy. Well, hey, you're not going to do what I want you to do? As a matter of fact, the eunuch says to him, he says, by the way, he says, Daniel, he said, do you realize that if you don't go along with this, it's going to be my head? Because he recognized that this was going to be a real big issue. And so there was this, it could jeopardize an easy life. It could jeopardize the potential promotions that had been promised to these guys. It might even get you, for us today, sometimes we make a fuss and we get fired from, even though it might be a good situation that we're looking to improve things. So there were issues there. And it's generally when you're having to make a decision and have to do right, you might be with friends, and the friends want to do something, and you say, I can't do that. And so, what do I do? How do I handle those kind of things? And so I think this was something that was a real issue there. Number two was doing the right things means trusting God for the outcome. Boy, I'll tell you, you get into a situation and things begin to heat up and the difficulties come and things, and you read the verse in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6. It says, without faith it's impossible to please him. Those that anyone that comes to God must believe that he exists, is a rewarder of them that seek him. And you say, oh, well, okay, now who am I going to follow? Am I going to follow the Lord? Am I going to do my own thing? Am I going to do what I think, what I want to do? Am I going to do it the way I want to do it? Because Satan comes, Satan comes to us and he challenges us. Hey, we need to trust our instincts because it makes sense to me. It's the most logical thing to do. It's what I see. It's something I can do. And so we go through these challenges and things. And if we haven't made a decision ahead of time that no matter what, I'm going to serve the Lord, I'm going to please the Lord in every decision I make, in everything that I do, because when I get in that situation, I'm going to say, Lord, I want to do your will. If we don't make that decision ahead of time, we will not make it in the heat of the immediate time. And that becomes a real problem because God's ways are almost always 180 degrees opposite of what I want to do. And a lot of times for Daniel, when he had purposed in his heart that he would not defile with a portion of the king's food or with the wine that he drank, therefore he made a request. And I think that's the key thing. Doing the right things means determining the purpose for the request. And when possible, find a creative alternative. The prince of the eunuchs did not come to Daniel and say, I want you to give up your God. I want you to now serve the God of Baal. And the way we're going to do that is you're going to eat this food. He didn't do that. They felt that from a health perspective, the best way for them to be the wisest and the most discerning and understanding and the brightest individuals was to eat this good, expensive food. And Daniel says, no, I'm not going to eat that food because it's been offered to idols. But that was not the issue. And therefore, Daniel comes to the eunuch and he says, listen, he said, let me just have a vegetarian diet. Let me just eat vegetables. Let me just eat those things. Notice in verse 9, he says, and in verse 8, here he says, to prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and compassion with the prince of the eunuchs, and the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord, the king, who hath appointed your food and your drink, for why should he see your face worse looking than the youths who are of your age? Then shall he make me endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had brought over Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test thy servant, I beseech thee, for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let us our countenance be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the youths that eat of the portion of the king's food, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter and tested them 10 days. So for 10 days they had vegetables. It was just the 4 of them. They ate their vegetables, they drank their water, and these other guys were drinking their wine and eating their expensive food and everything like that. Because the issue for Daniel was not the fact that he was having to disobey his God. He felt in his heart, I can't disobey God. But all they want to do is they want to have some guys that are healthy. And so he provides a creative alternative. That is probably one of the biggest challenges we have today in our country. Because so many times we think that anything that is proposed, any rule that's proposed, any restriction, any law, anything that's proposed, they're taking away my freedom. They're doing something that, I don't want them to do this. I'm not going to obey this. And we react to a lot of things when all they're looking for maybe is just to say, you know what, there are some things that are healthier than other things. And we have to, as Christians, I think we have to pick our fights. We have to pick our battles. And some battles are not worth fighting. For Daniel, it wasn't worth fighting over, what am I called? Am I called Daniel or am I called Belteshazzar? I'm not going to fight over that. I'm not going to fight over whether I go and learn. And they were apparently out 3 years, because it says that after 3 years they were brought before the king. So they learned all this stuff. But it didn't change Daniel, because his character was such that I'm going to serve God. And in my heart, and I know who I am. God knows who I am. And just because somebody gives me another name doesn't make any difference. And so he picks his battles. Now, later on, we're going to find in the book that that the forces begin to build against Daniel and against the 3 friends, and they're going to have to, and there's no alternative. Who am I going to bow down to? Am I going to bow down to the image, or am I going to bow down to God? And so Daniel gets a free night in the lion's den. The 3 friends get a free opportunity in a hot tub. They go through those times, because there are times there's no alternative. There's the times that you either do what the world wants you to do, or you trust God. And when you trust God, it may cost you even some for their lives. But that's not every time. And I think this is something here with Daniel, that in chapter 1, this was something that he discerned, that all they were trying to do was have healthy young men. And Daniel says, I can do that with this diet, and it's going to accomplish your objective, but I'm not going to have to compromise my stand before the Lord. I don't have to eat something that's been sacrificed to idols. And it's interesting, when you come back to the New Testament, Paul kind of says the same thing. He says, you go to somebody's house, and they set before you and in Paul's day, the best meat that you could buy was generally bought at the meat market of the temple. And so they would go down there. Hey, that preacher's coming to town, so you get the best piece of meat and serve it. We were in Africa, and we were invited to some people's homes, and they served some food. I have no idea what I ate. I didn't ask what I ate, but I ate it and enjoyed it, and it was good. I'm glad I didn't know what it was, because, and there are many times like that. But he says, if somebody says to you, guess what? I had this blessed by the priest of the idol before I brought it home. Paul says, don't eat it for their conscience sake, for their sake. He said, the idol's nothing. These idols that were in Babylon, Daniel knew that they were absolutely nothing. There was nothing to those idols. They were simply imagination and statues and things that man had made up. And they were demonic background and things, but they were nothing compared to God. So Daniel knew who he was. And so where there was an opportunity, Daniel simply said, let me do this. He says, you test me. He said, after 10 days, he said, we'll see. Now, they always like the comedy part of Scripture, because after 10 days, the prince of the eunuch comes to Daniel, looks at Daniel and his three friends, and these guys are virile and handsome and really just ready to go. And I'm sure the other guys are coming in, and they're, they depending on how much they drank of the king's wine, they didn't look as good. And what happens? They take the rich diet away from all the others. Can you just imagine the squawking and the complaints when that diet now, when they simply get water and vegetables, and that becomes their diet. But the point is that it's not always necessary for us to stand up and fight. There are times that save your energy. Daniel and his three friends would save their energy, and there would be times when they would simply stand up, and the three friends said, hey, put us in the fire. If we burn up, that's fine, but we're not going to worship your God. And there are times to make that stand, but that's not every time. And sometimes they often say that sometimes you can get more benefit out of honey than you can with vinegar. And sometimes it's necessary for us to stop and back up a little bit, because you see, with freedom comes responsibility. And so as I trust the Lord, and for Daniel had purposed in his heart. I'm sure on his way to Babylon, he probably had some discussions with the Lord. And as he gets there, these things were not, even when he prays, and he, and he's told to bow down to the idol, he simply goes into his house and prays like he had done before. You don't start doing something right in the heat of the moment when you're pressured into something. You simply start doing something right away, and then you're ready when the moment comes. And then, because then you think, why are they asking me to do this? One of the things I have, and I'm not a politician, I have never gone to a council meeting or anything, but I think, why in the world do they put a speed limit in an area? Especially 25-mile-an-hour speed limits, or 30-mile-an-hour speed, 70-mile-an-hour speed limits. Why do they put those? Well, it's to punish me as a Christian. It's to determine my sanctification. How spiritual am I? I was starting out from my house, and I had my grandson with us this morning, and I had just started out, and I had gone to the first speed bump in our subdivision there, and he says, "Grandpa, do you always drive this fast?" And I wasn't even over, I think, but to him, and I said, "Yes." But those rules and regulations, but they're not made to punish me. They're made for the benefit and the safety of people around. So it's not something that I'm not going to stand out in the corner and protest and hang up my little sign, 70 miles an hour speed limit is unfair to Christians. That's not the point. They put restrictions on food and some things, and why something. It's for safety reasons. We have to understand, but don't we complain? Oh my gosh, we complain even about those things. You've heard me complain a lot about speed limits. That's my. But since I have some very, very fine police officers in the church, I try to be cooperative in those things. But the point is that it's so easy for us as Christians to think that everything is against us. That's not true. Daniel learned the difference between what was simply a desire to reach a good accomplished end, and had an alternative, as opposed to somebody that was out to destroy him. And I think, okay, you complain about the speed limit. Well, plan your time so that you leave a little bit earlier so you don't have to speed. Now, I'm preaching to myself on that. But that's the way, you do some creative things because the objective is not harmful. And this was Daniel's situation. Our goal should be, and I want you to go back with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And Paul in 9, beginning of verse 19, he says, "And though I am free from all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all, that I may gain the more. And unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that myself under the law, not being myself under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. To them that are without law, as without law, being not myself without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I have made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker of it with you." So many times we have very selfish motives. Daniel was going to have an opportunity to do far more in Babylon than he ever would have done in Judah. Daniel was living and grew up in difficult times. The kings were not good. The nation had gone into idolatry under Manasseh and still had all sorts of problems and things. Things were not good, and they were not listening. They were not listening to the prophets. Jeremiah was preaching. Isaiah had preached before, and they weren't listening to the prophets. They weren't doing any of those things. But Daniel was taken against his will, brought to Babylon. Whether he was made a eunuch physically or not, I don't know. We're not really sure, because the word can be used simply as a individual, or just as a prince. But Daniel's influence was tremendous during that time, because of the fact that as a young man, he said, "I'm going to serve God no matter what." And God blessed him, and God used him. God put him in some difficult circumstances, but Daniel never wavers. He's one of those that nothing is ever bad is ever said about him that he ever had sinned, such as Joseph is another one. But Daniel had purposed in his heart. We sing a little chorus, "Dare to be a Daniel." And I think sometimes that we don't challenge with the young people and those, all of us. We're facing times in the United States where we're going to have to many times decide one way or another, okay, where are we going to come down on this? I hope that we'll purpose in our heart that, you know what, it doesn't matter what the political winds are, how it shifts and everything like that. I'm going to serve the Lord. I'm going to put Christ first. And I've got freedoms, but with those freedoms comes responsibility, because I want to be responsible for the people around me. I want to make sure that they know about Jesus Christ, their personal Savior. When you do business, what do people see as a business person? What do people see as all these things transpire in your life? Do they see Christ? That's our desire. And I think that was the thing with Daniel. The thing that we will see over and over and over and over again is a young man, very privileged young man, put in a very difficult situation, that determined ahead of time, I will serve God through it all. I would trust that would be our prayer, our desire, that no matter what we're put in, what the circumstances are in our life, that from beginning to end, and Daniel was faithful throughout all those years, all the changes. The one thing that I have been impressed with, we support a a mission organization called Believers Express in the Congo. Rich, about 30-some years ago, determined to open a radio station. And the radio station went on the air and was actually, President Mobutu actually gave Rich a license and made Rich a citizen and gave a special license to Radio Kuzi. That radio station has remained on the air for almost 30 years now through a number of wars and coups and things like that. And it doesn't matter who is going into power. Every group that comes into power has recognized and has allowed Radio Kuzi to stay on the air because of one thing. They said they're honest. They're honest. They share Christ, but they stay above the political fray. They don't get involved in all of these things, and they present Christ, and they have been allowed to be on the air and have a lot of times been given special privileges simply because of the fact that they never wavered in their stand. I think that's Daniel. Daniel was a young man that was brought into a situation and never wavered. May that be said of us individually, that we will take our stand and be a Daniel in this generation today. Let's pray. Father, we are grateful for this testimony. We're grateful for the little insights that we see of Daniel and his friends and how you were working, how you were orchestrating all these things about. Help us to understand, Father, that even in today's society, there's a lot of political thought, there's a lot of tensions that are going on in people's lives and rhetoric and all the things that are going on. I pray, Father, that as we are emotionally a lot of times involved in these things, and we hear them and we react to them and we think about them, help us to understand, Father, that you are bringing about the close of this dispensation of grace, that you are putting up and you put down, and that we as Christians have a privilege of living in a climate that is deteriorating quickly, but we have the privilege of living in that climate as an ambassador for Jesus Christ. Daniel was an ambassador for Israel in Babylon. Help us to look at his example, and even from today on, purpose within our heart that regardless of how the winds blow around us, that we will stop and say, we're here on assignment to present Jesus Christ to a very, very needy world. And may we become all things to all men, that by all means we might win some. And may Jesus Christ be honored and praised and glorified through our life. And may we truly have a testimony, even as Daniel had, that he served God. And may that be our testimony today as well. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.